All right, let's get right into it. We're talking about a method of justice that feels like it's straight out of the history books, but it just happened in South Carolina, ending a silence that stretched over 2 decades. Picture a room where the silence is so heavy you can almost feel it. That was the scene inside the execution chamber, a quiet that was stretched tight across 20 years of pain, fear, and loss for the families of Stephen Bryant's victims. And here's where things get really cold and methodical. This isn't chaos, it's a chillingly precise ritual. Stephen Bryant, 44 years old, is strapped to a metal chair. A hood goes over his head, and then a small red bullseye is taped right over his heart, an unmistakable target for what's coming next. From only 15 feet away, 3 rifles fired. Witnesses said you could see the target on his chest snap forward as his body convulsed. A doctor then steps up, presses a stethoscope to his chest, and with just a single nod, it's over. The final declaration is made. So, how did we even get here? I mean, this story doesn't start in that death chamber. No, it starts 21 years ago out on some lonely rural roads where the simple act of being kind became a deadly mistake. And this really lays out the timeline of the terror. We're talking about just 5 days. In that short time, Bryant murdered 3 men. 2 were just strangers who made the mistake of offering him a ride. The third, TJ Taityen, was killed in his own home after Bryant pretended his car broke down. The very act of helping someone had become the trap. And then there was this just an absolutely bone-chilling confession. Right after he murdered TJ Taityen, Taityen's phone rang. Bryant picked it up himself, and in this flat, cold voice, he told the person on the other end exactly what he'd done. It was just an act of pure, calculated cruelty. So you have to ask yourself, right? Who was this man behind these horrible acts? Was he just a monster, plain and simple? Or was there maybe a more complicated story buried somewhere in his past? And this is where the story gets complicated. You see these 2 sides of Stephen Bryant. On one hand, you have the monster who terrorized a community. But on the other, you have a man whose past was just soaked in trauma. We're talking sexual and physical abuse, brain damage, and an addiction so bad he was smoking joints sprayed with bug killer. His own lawyer called him a soul tortured from the inside out. But, at the end of the day, the courts were firm. They looked at his traumatic past, and their conclusion was pretty clear. While that history might help explain his actions, it could never, ever excuse them. Which brings us to a huge question. A firing squad? In this day and age? Why? It sounds like something out of a different century. To get why this method is making a comeback, we really need to look at what's been happening with executions in South Carolina. Well, for 13 years, a whole 13 years, executions in the state just stopped. Not because of some big moral shift, but for a really practical reason. They couldn't get their hands on the drugs needed for lethal injections. But once executions started back up in 2024, the pace has been relentless. Stephen Bryant was the 7th person executed in just a little over a year. That's a huge shift. And using this specific method is becoming more and more common. With those lethal injection drugs still hard to get, the firing squad is back on the table as a real alternative. Bryant's execution just confirms it. In South Carolina, bullets are back. And this, of course, kicks off a fierce debate. Is the firing squad a barbaric relic, a huge step backward into a more violent past? Or, as some people argue, is it actually the most precise and reliable method left, especially when you compare it to lethal injections that have been known to go horribly wrong? So let's go back, one last time, to that death chamber, to the 10 witnesses behind the glass who had waited for 2 decades for this exact moment. You have to understand, for the families of TJ Taityen and the other victims, the wheels of justice turn incredibly slowly. For over 20 years, they were just stuck in this state of uncertainty, waiting for a final chapter that felt like it might never actually come. Bryant's final meal, seafood stir-fry, fried fish, stuffed shrimp, chocolate cake, it almost feels irrelevant, doesn't it? It's really just a footnote. Because in the end, this story was never really about him. It was about those families, holding hands, finally watching him take his last breath. So from one point of view, those 3 rifle shots delivered exactly what the families had been denied for so long. Certainty. Closure. It was the final, definitive end to their 21-year wait. For them, this was justice. But then again, there's another way to see this. Maybe it's proof that we haven't moved as far from our own violent history as we'd like to think. It suggests that when one way of executing people doesn't work, we're willing to reach back to another, no matter how brutal it seems. You know, the sound of a firing squad isn't something that just fades away. It echoes, and it really makes you wonder, for society, for the families, and for our own ideas of what justice is, what kind of echoes are left behind when the final word is delivered by a bullet?